My wife will never cheat on me, but she will never love me either. She will never initiate sex.
So
she won't even talk about it. She won't connect with me emotionally.
For years, whispers of tension and betrayal swirled behind the polished image of Daystar TV. Now, Joni Lamb and Doug Weiss are pulling back the curtain, speaking openly for the first time about the wounds, the infidelity, and the emotional distance that nearly tore everything apart. What they reveal isn't just personal. It challenges the very image of the ministry they helped build. The truth is raw, unfiltered, and it will change how you see them forever. Doug Weiss didn't walk onto the Daystar set that day with a polished speech or carefully rehearsed talking points. He came in raw, emotional, and willing to open the door to a part of his personal life most people in ministry never want to talk about. Sitting under the studio lights, looking straight into the camera, he began to share a truth that caught a lot of viewers off guard. "My wife will never cheat on me," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "But she will never love me either." It wasn't a line meant for shock value. It was a confession from someone who had lived through years of a marriage that looked fine on the outside, but felt completely empty on the inside. Doug went on to explain something he called intimacy anorexia. It wasn't just about a lack of physical affection, he said. It was about living with a partner who withholds emotional connection, spiritual closeness, and any real sense of partnership. He described it as being married, but feeling utterly alone, night after night, year after year. No deep talks, no shared prayers, no warmth. Just silence, distance, and a growing wall between two people who once promised to share a life. The way he spoke wasn't bitter or angry. It was exhausted. It was the voice of someone who had carried that kind of loneliness for far too long. Joni Lamb, sitting across from him, listened intently before adding her own perspective. She spoke about the deep pain many women feel when they discover their husbands have been unfaithful, or when they realize they've been emotionally shut out of their marriage. She talked about how often that pain is minimized, dismissed, or outright ignored, especially in Christian circles where the focus is more on saving the marriage than truly hearing the wounded spouse. It was a rare moment of raw honesty on live Christian television, the kind of conversation that usually happens in private counseling rooms, not in front of cameras. But once the broadcast ended, something unexpected happened. The discussion didn't stay focused on the topic. Instead, many viewers began looking more closely at Doug and Joni themselves. Some said they admired the vulnerability, that it was refreshing to see leaders be so open about their struggles. Others weren't so sure. The more people thought about what Doug had said, the more they began to wonder if there was more going on behind the scenes than just an honest conversation about marriage. Social media started filling up with comments questioning the state of their own relationship. Was this confession simply a way to talk about a past marriage? Or was it an indirect reflection of something current? The reaction was split right down the middle. On one side were those who felt a sense of relief hearing someone, especially a man in ministry, talk openly about loneliness in marriage. On the other were those who felt uneasy, sensing there was a deeper layer to the story. The vulnerability drew people in, but it also opened the door to scrutiny. Daystar viewers, who had watched Joni for years and respected her leadership, suddenly found themselves asking whether the personal lives of their spiritual leaders matched the public image they presented. Doug's words may have been meant to shed light on a difficult topic, but they also shined a spotlight on him and Joni in ways neither of them could fully control. What started as a heartfelt confession ended up being the spark for a conversation that has yet to quiet down. A conversation about marriage, leadership, authenticity, and whether the people in front of the cameras are really living the values they teach. If you want, I can now do the next point: concerns from close friends and ignored warnings in the same storytelling style so the flow stays consistent. From the very beginning, there were voices, steady, experienced, and deeply invested in Joni Lamb's life, that spoke up with warnings about her relationship with Doug Weiss. These weren't casual acquaintances making passing comments. They were people who had stood beside her through years of ministry, personal trials, and public scrutiny. They knew her heart, they knew her values, and they knew the weight of every decision she made, especially when it came to matters that could affect both her personal life and the future of Daystar. The first concerns began surfacing quietly, long before her marriage to Doug was official. Friends, family members, and even pastors noticed how quickly the relationship was moving. For many of them, it wasn't just the pace, it was the timing. Doug had recently finalized his divorce from his wife Lisa, a split that, according to some accounts, happened under circumstances that were still murky. To those closest to Joni, this raised an obvious question. Was there enough time for real healing, reflection, and discernment before diving into something so serious? Denise Boggs was among the first to put her concerns in writing. She had known Joni for years, not as a casual friend but as someone who understood the unique pressures and responsibilities that came with leading a major Christian ministry. Denise wasn't one to speak without reason. When she sat down to write her letter to the Lamb family, it came from a place of urgency. She described what she saw as a spirit of deception surrounding Joni, the kind of emotional fog that makes it difficult to see red flags clearly. Her words were direct, and she didn't sugarcoat the risks. She pointed to specific examples where Joni appeared to dismiss legitimate concerns about Doug's past, especially his previous divorce, in favor of trusting his version of events without deeper investigation. Joni's children, Jonathan, Rachel, and Rebecca, also tried to speak up. They had grown up in the public eye, watching their parents navigate both triumph and scandal. They knew firsthand how quickly personal matters could spill over into ministry, affecting not just their family but thousands of viewers who saw their mother as a role model. Their concerns weren't rooted in jealousy or mistrust of their mother's judgment. They were protective, shaped by years of watching her lead with strength and integrity. They reminded her of the values she had always championed: patience, prayer, and discernment before making life-changing commitments. But their voices didn't seem to land. Joni reportedly told them they were operating from a spirit of fear and that their concerns were unfounded. That response stung deeply. For her children, it wasn't about being right. It was about making sure their mother wasn't walking into a situation that could cause long-term harm. Being dismissed so quickly made them feel sidelined, as though their perspective no longer held the same weight it once did. Pastor Valerie Hardwell, a widow who had walked through grief and eventually found love again, also stepped forward. Valerie's experience gave her a unique perspective. She knew the loneliness and vulnerability that can follow loss, but she also knew the importance of slowing down and seeking clarity before stepping into a new relationship. She questioned whether Joni had truly taken the time to hear from God, or if she was interpreting her own desires as divine confirmation. Valerie was gentle in her approach but firm in her concern. She warned that Joni might be telling herself a story that wasn't fully true, convincing herself that this marriage was God's plan without fully weighing the possible consequences. Then there was Pastor Rodney Howard Brown, whose approach was far more direct. He reportedly spoke to Joni's children and made it clear that in his view, marrying Doug Weiss would be a mistake, with serious spiritual consequences. He went as far as saying that if Joni went through with it, she would be living in sin, and he would no longer support or appear on Daystar. His words weren't meant to be diplomatic. They were a blunt warning from someone who had been part of the ministry world long enough to see what happens when leaders ignore wise counsel. What made these warnings so striking was the sheer range of people giving them. They weren't all from the same background, and they didn't all have the same style of communication, but they were united in one thing: concern. Concern for Joni as a woman, concern for her as a leader, and concern for Daystar as a ministry. Yet, despite this chorus of voices, Joni chose to move forward. To those on the outside, it looked as though she surrounded herself with people who affirmed her decisions rather than challenged them. While that's a natural human tendency, we all want to be supported. In leadership, it can be dangerous. Friends who always agree may feel safe, but they don't always help you see the full picture. Some of the people who raised concerns later admitted that they felt a mix of sadness and frustration. Sadness because they believed Joni was stepping into a relationship that might bring her more pain than joy. Frustration because they felt she had shut the door on voices that had always been there to protect her. This wasn't just about personal relationships. The implications reached into the ministry itself. Daystar wasn't simply Joni's private life, it was a public trust. Decisions she made, especially high-profile ones, could shape the network's credibility, its viewer loyalty, and even its financial stability. Close friends feared that if Doug's past controversies resurfaced or if his counseling methods drew negative attention, the fallout would land directly on Daystar. As months passed, those warnings began to look less like speculation and more like foresight. Allegations about Doug's counseling practices, questions about his past marriage, and concerns about the rapid timeline of their relationship started to gain traction among viewers. Some of the very scenarios her friends had predicted were now being discussed openly on social media and in church circles. For the people who had spoken up early, it was a bittersweet moment. They didn't want to be right, because being right meant watching someone they cared for walk into hardship. But they also knew that leadership without accountability is fragile. and that fragility can have ripple effects far beyond one person's life. In the end, the story of these ignored warnings isn't just about Joni and Doug. It's about the timeless truth that even the most experienced, respected leaders need to be willing to hear hard truths from the people who love them enough to speak them. When those truths are dismissed, the consequences often reach further than anyone expects, and the people left behind are often the same ones who tried to prevent the damage in the first place. For years, Joni Lamb built her image on a clear and unwavering set of values. She stood in front of cameras and behind pulpits, declaring that marriage was sacred, that it was worth fighting for, no matter how broken things seemed. Her words carried weight because they weren't just theory. They were rooted in her own life experience. When her husband Marcus was unfaithful back in 2010, she didn't walk away. She chose the harder path: forgiveness, counseling, and rebuilding trust. That choice became a central part of her testimony. Viewers admired her for it. She wasn't just talking about restoration, she was living it. That's why, for so many Daystar supporters, her marriage to Doug Weiss felt like a shock to the system. Doug's divorce was recent and, according to some accounts, not something his ex-wife had wanted. In fact, there were claims that she had hoped for reconciliation only for Doug to move forward with ending the marriage. When Joni aligned herself with him so quickly after that, it seemed to many like a complete break from the principles she had once championed. People began to notice the inconsistency, and they didn't hold back their questions. How could someone who had so passionately defended the idea of saving a marriage now embrace a relationship born from one that had ended in divorce? How could she reconcile her long-standing message of fighting for restoration with the decision that, to many, looked like giving up was acceptable? Then there was Doug's own history, which only fueled the skepticism. As a marriage counselor, he had built his career on advising couples through some of their hardest seasons. His brand was all about honesty, transparency, and guiding people toward healthy relationships. Yet it came to light that he hadn't disclosed his divorce to his counseling clients for almost a year after it was finalized. Even though his marriage to Lisa ended in May 2022, he continued meeting with couples as though nothing had changed at home. For a man in his position, that wasn't just an oversight. It struck many as a calculated decision to protect his image and keep business steady. This revelation didn't sit well with the public. If Doug could hide something so significant from the people who were paying him for guidance, what else could he be keeping back? It became harder for some viewers to trust his motives, especially when they remembered that his first steps toward a relationship with Joni had started as a business conversation about buying airtime on Daystar. That timeline, coupled with his public defense that his divorce was part of God's divine plan, made people uneasy. They felt like he was using spiritual language to justify actions that didn't line up with biblical teaching. The questions didn't stop there. Stories began to circulate about Doug's counseling methods, stories that many found troubling. Some clients claimed that he had advised women in abusive relationships to be physically intimate with their spouses as a way to heal the marriage. Others alleged that he brought unlicensed polygraph examiners into sessions to use lie detector tests on couples. Both practices raised ethical concerns, but they also painted a picture of someone whose approach could cross dangerous lines. For critics, these accounts weren't just quirks of style. They were signs of deeper problems in how Doug handled the responsibility of guiding vulnerable people. When you combine all of that with Joni's past public stance on marriage, the contradictions become hard to ignore. Viewers who had once seen her as a model of consistency and conviction were now questioning whether her choices were being guided by the same values she had always preached or by something else entirely. Was this a genuine love story, or was there more to it? Was Doug the partner she believed God had sent her, or was his history sending signals she didn't want to see? For many, it wasn't just about judging a personal relationship. It was about the integrity of a ministry they had trusted for years. Daystar's message had always been clear on the sanctity of marriage, but now that message seemed blurred. Some worried that this shift would make it harder for the network to speak with authority on issues of faith and family. Others feared that it would erode trust entirely, leaving viewers wondering if the leaders they followed were truly living out the values they claimed to hold. And so the questions remain. They hang in the air during broadcasts, linger in conversations among longtime supporters, and ripple through the online discussions that follow every new development. They're not the kind of questions that fade quickly. They stick because they cut to the heart of who Joni has always said she is. and whether that still matches who she is today. I can also take this further and write the next point, impact on Daystar's credibility and audience trust, in the same tone so it flows naturally. Would you like me to do that? When the public first began hearing about Doug Weiss's counseling techniques, most people didn't know what to think. On paper, he had the credentials, the books, the TV appearances, everything that made him look like a seasoned marriage counselor with years of wisdom behind him. But the more people dug into the details of how he actually worked with clients, the more uneasy they became. It wasn't just a matter of different styles or unique approaches. These were serious ethical questions that couldn't be brushed off as creative therapy methods. One of the most alarming stories came from women who had gone to Doug during some of the darkest seasons of their marriages. They weren't just struggling with a lack of intimacy. Some of them were dealing with emotionally abusive or deeply toxic relationships. Instead of prioritizing their safety, the allegations say Doug encouraged these women to initiate physical intimacy with their unrepentant husbands as a way to heal the marriage. To people hearing these accounts, that advice sounded less like professional counseling and more like pushing victims back into situations where they could be harmed, all in the name of preserving the relationship. It didn't take long for this to hit a nerve with Daystar viewers. For years, the network had positioned itself as a place of compassion, biblical counsel, and moral integrity. Hearing that Joni Lamb's new husband had allegedly given such controversial advice made people question whether the network was now aligned with values they couldn't support. After all, if the man at the center of the scandal was being defended or platformed by Daystar, what did that say about the network's own standards? But that wasn't the only troubling claim. There were also reports that Doug used polygraph tests in counseling sessions, not as a rare or emergency measure, but as a regular tool in certain cases. That alone was unusual enough. But what set off alarm bells was the allegation that these lie detector tests were sometimes administered by unlicensed examiners. To the average person, that might sound like a minor technicality. But in a professional counseling setting, it's a huge problem. It raises doubts about the reliability of the results, the legal implications, and the basic ethics of the practice. The image this painted was unsettling. Vulnerable couples coming to Doug in hopes of saving their marriages, only to be subjected to questionable tactics that might not have been fully legal or appropriate. And for those couples, the stakes weren't just emotional, they were spiritual. Many of Doug's clients were people of faith who saw marriage as a covenant before God. That meant the advice they received carried eternal weight in their eyes. If that advice was flawed or manipulative, the damage could be far deeper than just a failed relationship. As these stories began to circulate more widely, the focus shifted from Doug as an individual to what his connection with Daystar might mean for the network's future. Daystar has always relied heavily on viewer trust. It's not just a TV channel, it's a ministry. People donate because they believe in the mission. They believe in the people leading it, and they believe those leaders live according to the values they preach. But with Doug's alleged methods under the spotlight, that trust started to crack. Some viewers began to voice their fears openly. What if aligning with Doug Weiss caused Daystar to lose its moral authority? What if the network's message on marriage, faith, and integrity no longer rang true because of the company Joni was keeping? And perhaps the most pressing concern, what if the audience started walking away? In today's world, once credibility is damaged, it's incredibly hard to win it back. For a ministry that depends on both its reputation and financial support, that's a dangerous position to be in. Behind the scenes, there were whispers about donors starting to hesitate. It wasn't always dramatic, no massive boycott overnight, but the quiet unease was spreading. Longtime supporters who had given faithfully for years were suddenly wondering if their money was still going toward a cause they could stand behind. Others feared that younger viewers, who are often quick to spot hypocrisy, would turn away permanently if they sensed that Daystar was protecting its own, rather than holding them accountable. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Daystar had been through scandals before and had weathered the storms largely because of its ability to convince viewers that it was still holding the line on biblical truth. But this situation was different. This time, the questions weren't coming from critics outside the faith. They were coming from inside the Daystar community itself. Pastors, family friends, and even Joni's own children had expressed concern. That kind of internal dissent is far harder to dismiss because it comes from people who have been loyal for years. The fear wasn't just about losing viewership, it was about losing the very identity of the network. Daystar's brand has always been tied to the idea of strong Christian leadership, moral clarity, and consistency in living out biblical values. If that brand becomes associated with questionable counseling practices, unaddressed red flags, and a perceived lowering of moral standards, the damage could be long-term. And in the crowded world of Christian broadcasting, where trust is everything, that kind of damage could take years or even decades to repair. At the heart of it all is a simple truth. People expect integrity from those who lead ministries. They expect transparency when something goes wrong. They expect leaders to admit mistakes and take steps to fix them. If Daystar chooses to ignore the growing concerns about Doug Weiss and the methods he's accused of using, they risk sending a message that protecting an inner circle matters more than protecting the flock they serve. And that's the fear many can't shake. Not that Daystar will vanish overnight, but that it will slowly lose the respect, influence, and connection it's built over decades, not because of outside attacks, but because of decisions made from within. For a network that has prided itself on being a beacon of light in the world, that's a shadow it can't afford to let grow any darker.